And as you're joining us, if you could share in the chat where you're coming from and what amount of years you've been managing a school garden, we would love to know who's in the room. So where you're from, where you're joining us from, as well as what length of time, whether that's one day or multiple years that you've been managing a school garden. We will get started in about 30 seconds, just letting folks enter our Zoom room. Thanks so much for being here. Awesome. See some folks coming in. San Francisco, 4 years. Denver Public Schools, 12 years. Amazing. 1.5 years in Des Moines, Iowa. We've got some folks from all over the country. Awesome. Well, keep sharing that in the chat. Again, where you're from and what length of time you've been managing a school garden. It's so great to see all of you from different areas of the country and different lengths of time of experience in working with school gardens. Welcome, welcome. Awesome. Well, my name is Tristana Perkle, and I'm the director of the School Garden Support Organization-Network, the SGSO-Network. And today we are so excited to have a webinar with Chris De La Torre of Academy for Global Citizenship based in Chicago, Illinois. Chris will be talking all about nonlinear garden design as an identity-affirming garden practice. If you joined us last month for the Decolonizing Garden Education webinar, it was kind of a wonderful overview about different practices to decolonize our garden education. And Chris's presentation today will be just a perfect kind of deep dive specifically into garden design kind of within that framework. So that wasn't necessarily done on purpose, but it worked out perfectly. So thanks, Chris, for being here today to share with us. Just some housekeeping items, if you don't mind going to the next slide. This presentation and all of our presentations will be recorded and it'll be shared via email and in our recording library on our website in our webinars, on our webinars page, and I'll put that page into the chat here. We will also be sharing a copy of the slide deck and the resource handout in the chat. I will share that in just a moment. That way you'll have all the links available to you that Chris is sharing in this presentation, as well as other relevant links for the SGSO network. We are doing breakout rooms today for about 10 to 12 minutes, so you'll be able to kind of digest the information that Chris has been sharing and share it with others. We'd also love to hear your feedback. We seek to create webinars about topics that you all want to learn about. So we'd love to both hear how this webinar was for you and get your ideas on future topics that you'd love to hear from your fellow SGSO network members. So that will, I'll put that into the chat, the link to their survey, and it will also be included in your follow-up email that you'll get after this webinar. So please do fill that out. If you could go to the next slide. So this is the last of a webinar in a webinar series focusing on presentations from the Growing School Garden Summit, which was last April 2022. All of our presentations were presenters at the summit, and so it's really been wonderful to share these amazing presentations with a much broader group of folks if you weren't able to join us. All of the presenters are compensated for their time with generous support from the Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation. And Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation is also the host of the Growing School Garden Summit. But we do have some upcoming webinars outside of this webinar series. So in April and May, we are doing a district-led school garden programs kind of two-part webinar series. And specifically on April 19th, so next month, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll be diving specifically into organization and management. And this is for school garden programs that are run by a district staff, implemented and implemented by the district staff. So we'll be diving specifically into how does a district organize and manage a school garden program across the whole district on April 19th at 11 a.m. And then please stay tuned for additional dates and details for future webinars. And then I did also want to share about our newish newsletter. We launched it last September. We're sharing every other month kind of a deep dive into a specific topic within school garden programming. This just yesterday, we shared all about storytelling for your school garden. So I'll put those links into the chat. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, I recommend it. And then just want to make sure you save the date for the next Growing School Garden Summit. The summit happens every other year. So the next one will be March 15th through the 18th in 2024. So next March in San Diego. So hope you're able to join us, save the date. We hope to see you there. And with that, I believe I am passing it off to Chris. Thank you so much for being here, Chris.
Thank you so much for that awesome roadmap and for the invitation to speak with everyone today. I think, in our early conversations, I'd said that, I really feel like garden people are truly my people, which feels so good to be able to talk shop about what garden design actually looks like. I do also want to shout out Jamila Moore's workshop on decolonizing school gardens. And I would love to see if folks don't mind dropping in the chat whether they were able to see either live or watch the recording of Jamila's workshop, which was the workshop previous to this one. So I'm wondering, was anyone able to attend? Great. Okay, great. A few people, perfect. So as Tristana mentioned, it wasn't maybe totally on purpose, but it worked out really wonderfully to follow up Jamila's workshop, where she gracefully unpacked some pretty complicated and important actions and pedagogies about how our practice as garden educators evolves. And today we're really going to be looking at the very tangible parts of our gardens that can support some of that pedagogical practice, and also to make explicit some of the things that are happening in these garden spaces already that implicitly support and are identity affirming, but also make space for perspective taking and leveraging some of those high impact moves that we can do to make sure that these learning spaces, which are already liberatory spaces in the scope of, where students are meeting in school settings, and make that robust and dynamic and evolving. We'll be looking at a lot of examples today, so that hopefully as you go back and look at your spring planning and your crop plan, you're really able to pull from some of the inspiration that you've seen and replicate that to some degree in your own space. So I'm Chris, again, happy to be with everyone here today. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Wellness here in Chicago. We are a K-8 school called the Academy for Global Citizenship. You can do all the things, follow us in all of the places. You can email me with follow-up questions, but also very available. We'll make time at the end of today's session to have a little conversation as well. So, as I said, gardens are already in many ways these inherently liberatory spaces that allow for exploration and identity affirmation. And I'm sure every one of us at some point in our practice has seen a really wonderful and important example of a young person who may not find themselves in other aspects of the school space, but can find something about themselves in a garden space or in a nature space to learn. So today's workshop objectives are to really surface some of those ideas and safe spaces and practices. We're going to translate important anti-racist practices to the physical garden design. So how are you reimagining a raised bed or a nook or a corner of your classroom outdoors? We're going to be looking at design inspiration to integrate nonlinear, student-led, culturally responsive growing and learning spaces. And we're going to design to prioritize things like inquiry, cultural relevance, and perspective taking. And although I'm really going to work very hard to avoid false dichotomies, we're going to be looking at prioritizing those things over perfectionism, efficiency, and production. A little bit about the Academy for Global Citizenship. So we are a public charter operating on the southwest side of Chicago. So we serve students K through 8th grade. There are about 465 students on campus today. We are in the midst of a really interesting transitional moment where we are moving out of space that we've been essentially borrowing from Chicago public school system and moving into an energy and water net positive campus that's adjacent to a 2-acre diversified veggie farm. So a few really important parts of what this project means for our school and our community. The first of which is that we are part of the public school program. So it is free to attend our school. There is no tuition. It is a lottery system because it's a public charter. So we are not a charter network. We are really committed to piloting new ways, new systems of supporting young people in a learning space and sharing that back out to the district to be applied in whatever way possible. So one example of that is that we've designed this new campus for maximum efficiency and to make a lot of the learning transparent. So there will be ways for kids to check their energy readouts on a day-to-day basis. We'll have an opportunity to talk about how the geothermal wells reduce our carbon footprint with radiant heating through the floors. Students will be able to see the tops of the geothermal wells out in our schoolyard. There'll be a lot of nature play spaces with native plantings, and we are working on that design at the same cost per square foot as any new CPS project. So the idea is we can build schools better and also think of the school truly as part of that classroom, the school and building and campus as a teacher. So we are working on that. Stay tuned. Our plan is to open. Right now, we are mostly on track to open in school year 23-24. From 15 years of community engagement, talking to community members about the role and function of what our school does, we heard a lot about community need and what we're now calling these sort of upstream factors that really have significant impact on student success at school, right? And those are the things that y'all are familiar with. Are kids coming to school hungry? Are they coming to school underslept? Is there instability about their living situation? And so, every one of those things, plus a myriad more, really impact our families and our community. And from this research and work, we've now extended into a separate 501c3 called Cultivate Collective. And Cultivate Collective is the entity that's committed to focusing on the community-facing issues at hand, to play an advocacy role, to really connect access to good foods that's happening as part of our school day, but make sure there are opportunities for community members who might be outside the scope of our AGC families. So we are now Academy for Global Citizenship and Cultivate Collective, and we'll be sharing this energy, positive energy and water net positive school ground. So, I've shared a little bit of kind of the overview of the school, and, you can look at data and statistics like we're a Title I school, we're 97% minority student population. We serve almost 100% of our student body is within 5 miles of our school. We're on the southwest side of Chicago in a neighborhood that is under-resourced with some of the lowest air quality in the entire city. And how that actually plays out on the ground with our student body, there is still joy here. There are so many parts of the way that we work with young people, the way that our students engage with the curriculum and the outdoor space and our school meals. And it's important to also name and recognize that beyond all of those statistics, beyond the barriers that our students face, these are beautiful, joyful young people who show up enthusiastically to school for the most part, within reason, right? They have their ups and downs just like the rest of us, but we're really, really excited about translating some of the pedagogy and practice of our school actually into our real, into the campus and campus building for actually an affirming and generative learning space. So a few other things about the school: we are a bilingual school, so English, Spanish. We work through an IB curriculum, so there are unit themes, which is important to note because the way that we integrate our curriculum and look at anti-racist practices and the histories that we're studying as part of those unit themes, it's all connected. And we are working really hard. We're not perfect at it, but we're working really hard to use the garden truly as a tool in teachers' toolbox to communicate complex ideas that are related to their theme, Common Core Standards, NGSS. We're trying to keep these things speaking to each other as much as possible so that the garden isn't a place to check out for teachers or students, but it plays a functional role in the educational day. So one of the really important parts of truly anti-racist practice is a self-reflection, right? Understanding how your lenses have evolved over time. And that's even in our garden practice, right? So when I'm thinking about how my lens evolved and what my standards of a good-looking garden, a successful garden, how those things have developed over time, and then the messaging that I'm sharing back with my students, I had two key experiences. One of those was working on a school garden in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and the community was at this really interesting intersection of a West Indian community and a Hasidic, one of the largest Hasidic populations in the city of New York. And so the customers that we were serving, the type of interactions we were having, the things that we were growing, the cultural funds of knowledge that were strong and robust in both of those communities really impacted how we operated and how we approached the students that we met day to day. On the other side of that, I participated in an apprenticeship at a place called Blue Hill at Stone Barns. Some of you might be familiar. It is a beautiful, it is the ideal of a gentleman's farm with a complicated land history, robust funding, just about as resourced as it could possibly be. And we were growing to supply on a pretty limited basis back to the community, but actually feeding selling our crops back to a world-renowned fine dining restaurant that 0.01% of people get to eat at in their lives. And there were some really, really particular standards that were rigid. There were definitely wrong and right ways to grow things in that space. And it wasn't really a collaborative space, right? So thinking about those two aspects of my training and my history and what's evolved in how I believe a garden should look, it's important when I'm running up against tensions in my practice and my work to try to draw those lines back to some part of my training and understanding and know that these things were constructed just as important as I believe they may be. There's still constructions of that experience, right? And it doesn't mean that they're particularly the last word. So I also want to recognize and celebrate that if you were in this workshop today, there are probably a lot of things happening in your garden space that are really identity affirming, and that you're already doing so much that makes these gardens liberated spaces. And let's just take a snapshot of that. So Tristana put up our poll. We're looking at what's serving you right now. Okay, a lot of people are looking at heritage planting practices, working on signage. Great. And we do have a few people coming in the other category. So I hope you remember this moment and you bring this back to your small group settings. So the work of this session and the work of continuously improving our garden spaces is not to think about wholesale change. We're not looking to reinvent the garden space. We're looking to honor what is already happening that is good there, and then also to draw some lines and make decisions with intent and purpose, and then also to share out those decisions like that are going to address or sort of externalize anti-racist practices. We're looking to connect those things and to have an ongoing practice that's responsive to our student body. So that you can already see there's so much happening in our gardens, and maybe we're doing things already that with just a little bit further push could really make them important and meaningful spaces for young people when they come to work with us. All right, and I just want to close out this poll. This book will be in your list of resources, but thinking about gardens, and I love this quote, and it's a really beautiful story of community and individual identity and perspective taking, but a garden helps solidify a community and brings people of various ages, cultures, and ethnicities together for a common purpose, bettering themselves and their neighborhood. So with that in mind, the guiding question of this workshop and our time together is, how can we design culturally affirming garden spaces for ourselves, the community, and the students where we practice, and embody anti-racist behaviors and beliefs? And what does that look like specifically? And these are some of the guideposts that I use when I'm looking at the actual construction of the garden. And what's really important, and I'd mentioned this earlier, is really trying to avoid dichotomies. Things are good or bad. We are racist or we are anti-racist. That all of these things are in flux, and it's a process of praxis, right? We're trying these on. We're working together with people. We're testing theories. We're moving the work forward. We're changing bed designs. We're changing maybe signage and language, and we're working with students so that our garden space, the actual space, is moving and changing alongside the people that we're working with, right? So it's this constant reflection and practice, reflection, redoing, and it's very action oriented. So I love this concept of legible versus illegible, and there will be some kind of interesting research and academic writing about these ideas of what is legible and illegible. And this is the piece where that self-reflection is really critical, because what is legible to me is 100% based on my lived experience and my funds of knowledge, right? What is illegible to me may be a gap in my experience and knowledge, and that is causing me to undervalue or dismiss something that might be an important part or opportunity in our garden space. So we're looking at things that, if we have a strong response to like, oh, this garden's a mess, or this bed doesn't make sense, or we're totally ignoring the companion planting rules and it's going to be harder to, harvest, or there's not enough airflow, right? If things are seeming illegible to us, that's a moment to pause and kind of self-reflect on what about it is illegible, and do others understand what's going on? So that efficiency and inquiry, this is always a push and pull in the garden season. And if any of you are operating in programs that are outside of schools where your production is part of your funding model, this is always going to be such a challenge, right? Many of us are working in contexts where we're balancing our ability to produce pounds of produce, which may actually impact the funding that's supporting the action, but then also the opportunity for inquiry, right? Some spaces need to draw you in, and the priority may need to be an educational moment over an efficiency moment, and towing the line between those two things. It's not easy, but it's okay if you make it explicit, right? If you know that that's the thing that you're balancing, and you can, particularly if you're leading a program or if you're managing people who are running the farm, educators on the farm, or if you have educators and production farmers, having that conversation about the efficiency and inquiry moments, and that one will not always be priority over the other. They'll flip. Affirmation and perspective taking. So I think, part of an important course correct in our nation can sometimes be a too hard swing in one direction or the other, right? And there were so many examples where across the country, we're trying to balance this, right? So identity affirmation, for example, I think of our school food menu, where we are iterating, evolving our school food menu, especially as we move to a new location with a 2-acre production farm. And as we're building out the menu, we're looking at, 93% of our student body is Hispanic, Latine, from, and many are immigrants, first generation, second generation. And so looking at, does the menu entirely reflect that population? We have really strong representation. Or how can we start conversations that kind of intermix representations from a lot of different heritage diets? And how do we talk about the reason for that? And how do we introduce new flavors? And what connections are we going to make in the garden? So thinking about balancing affirmation versus perspective taking, and prioritizing both of those things, and messaging to our students that it's just as important to know who you are as it is to pause and try to look through someone else's perspective and lens. And then, of course, I think one that a lot of growers love to talk about, could talk about all day, is how we move from rigid systems to ecosystems. I will say that a permaculture practice is not a large part of my technical training. And I would imagine there are tons of people in this space who can really share some cool permaculture designs. I hope you do so in your small group breakouts, but there are lots of other ways to understand that ecosystem relationship. We'll talk a little bit about the MILPA, soil health, nutritional health. We will integrate that a little bit today, but I also want to be really transparent that this is a place for me to grow professionally and to learn, but really hope to hear from some people who maybe are using permaculture models in their school gardens now, and what does that look like? And no presentation, no webinar about praxis and iterating could happen without Paulo Freire weighing in at some point. Also a thinker who had a tremendous impact on my practice as an educator and as a gardener, as a grower, as a community member. And he said, it is not enough for people to come together in dialogue in order to gain knowledge of their social reality, right? Like, we're all here in dialogue right now. And then the next step after this webinar is that people must act together upon the environment. And that's why we're really focused on what we build tangibly in our gardens in order to critically reflect upon the reality and so transform it through further action as part of a critical reflection, right? So that also is this invitation to try. You may design this great spiral garden or try to build a hill so you can practice some terraced gardening and open up conversations maybe about aquaculture or some sort of risky project that may not look perfect. It may not be a perfect construction. It may not be the most productive space of your garden. You might even start it and never finish, but to think about being process oriented, because that also gives students opportunities to take the lead and to understand what happens when you try, and know that, gardening is a practice. We're all here as a practice. So I want to take a moment, and I'd love to go back to the chat and ask folks to drop a word in the chat that comes up for you as you're looking at these two images. So take just a moment. The image on the right is actually of one of the sites at our school. And I'm just curious. We'll wait for a couple more descriptions. Okay, so I'm seeing words like interplanted, confined, boxes, suburban, efficient, linear, rows, grid, and something that I think is important to kind of challenge ourselves and push ourselves back towards is trying not to give these different styles, and I've kind of set us up here, but, some of the descriptors that come to mind definitely have a valence, right? There's a charge here, and there are trade-offs no matter what design we choose for our garden. So for example, row crop farming and linear design and a bed of a certain width and length, all of those practices came out of looking for efficiency and airflow and ease for access and, to make it harvestable and ergonomic. None of these things are bad things inherently. But when we get stuck in one way of thinking, particularly in school gardens, that's when we start to miss out on some of the opportunities for students to see themselves, see their heritage, to open up different interactions that make space for inquiry-based learning, right? Okay, we have a question in the chat. Okay, square foot raised beds. Just want to shout out a couple more folks. So essentially it's looking at different designs and reflecting on how we kind of viscerally respond. So I'd like to see if folks could take a moment, look at this image and throw out some adjectives or descriptors that come up for you when you are seeing this image. Okay, really interesting. So partly because it was our second time around, we had our second opportunity to practice. We are seeing a lot of responses coming in, and they run between populated, compressed, dense, cultural, too much, anxiety, amaze, crowded, developing country, where is nature, design in response to environment, networks, fluid, terraced, crowded, organic, colorful, human, elevated, which I love. This, I think our visceral responses to both of these arrangements does tell us something about legibility, right? And I think a lot of times what is illegible to us based on our lived experience can be anxiety inducing, can seem impenetrable. We might ask questions about, like, how does this function? It's hard to see the buildings from the nature space. And for others, the topography dictating this construction and the vibrancy of this space and how colorful it is and how, constructed spaces for living are really flowing in and out and responding in some ways more intuitively to the nature space than, for example, row cropping or a suburban grid design or what we call like a well-planned city grid. So it's a human tendency, right, to try to make sense in the world. We're meaning-making machines and we're looking for patterns. And based on our experience and funds of knowledge and programming, we want to assign like good or bad value, but really trying, particularly in our garden spaces where the risks are limited, right? The risks are low. And so pushing ourselves outside of those comfort areas and looking for different models from around the world to open up how we actually construct our gardens in schools can really lead to some juicy, rewarding, unique interactions and opportunities in that garden space. So this is a picture that I took in Medellin, and I grew up between Mexico and the United States. My dad is in Mexico, and I spent some portion of my childhood in Colorado. And so when I saw this construction, I felt like vibrant, right? I loved the organicness of how this community built around these hills, and Medellin is in this essentially basin with hills all around. In some ways reminded me of Mexico City. And I was just really fired up by this image and had realized that, because of the education I had as a farm apprentice, I was really, really committed to the efficiency of land use and efficiency of production, and missed out on something artful and abundant in the way that I was designing and coaching garden educators, first for the Chicago Botanic Garden, but also in a school space. So I started to make some changes. And again, knowing that there are trade-offs for every decision we make. So this is an image from 2 seasons ago, and thinking about that abundance and density and opportunity for inquiry, where a space may initially seem chaotic or crowded upon first glance, but it invites students in, right? It invites students in to explore. So we created this bed of kale and hardy greens with the idea that we would have as many different types of kale as possible with different colors and textures. The trade-offs, it was, did kale stalks on the edges get harvested more often than ones in the center? Did we have to keep an eye out for downy mildew? Did we have to make sure and clear out debris down below to reduce pests and spread of disease? We did, but it wasn't a crazy lift. And what actually ended up happening is we had this really attractive bed that kids got up close to. And this particular 3rd grade class was engaged in an inquiry and exploration. And what had happened is we'd harvested the kale enough so that they were sort of in their palm tree state, and kids wanted to get down low. And, it was one of those moments where a student said, there's a whole world down here. And kids were jumping into this garden space in a different way than we had seen, because we let go of some of the rhythm and linear planting design, and in a really small, accessible way had just played with moving in a different direction. So some of these interventions can happen on a really small scale, and you just make observations about what works. So we're going to get into some images now of different things that you can implement in your garden. So also wanted to look at this term biocultural that interweaves linguistic, cultural, and biological life. And in plain language, that's how we're talking, signage, the way we're communicating what's in the garden, colors, music, designs, things that you're planting, and then the biological piece of recognizing everything is is interrelated. So some of these images, they're from a design firm that was trying to bring some of these ideas alive and integrate them into the new campus. So you'll see examples of creating little like rock garden areas with edibles interspersed and planted in between. You could play with this a little bit in your gardens, creating spaces that are pathways with stones and little walking areas that invite students in. So maybe you're sacrificing a little bit of production space, but giving student-friendly spaces to explore, creating archways where students can run. They're like kid-friendly, maybe a little less accessible to adults, but really narrowing the way students move through your garden. Also thinking about natives, perennials, so that some parts of your garden are low maintenance year after year once they get established, but they're also these perfect talking points in the history of the land that you're on. So you're talking about it through annual edibles, but also looking at perennials and who and what was on the land before. Thinking about small interventions that you can use if you have some topography on the land. So low-lying areas, places that are tiered, and creating, small examples of other farming styles that are from around the world. And then there are some examples, and you'll get a whole folder filled with resources for natives and ground covers. And if you're looking at some of these, a lot of these have medicinal and culinary connections to heritage diets. So they're serving a dual purpose. You're adding in ground cover to create a more ecosystem focused planting, but you're also interspersing things that you can talk about, like lamb's quarters, plantains, dandelions, portulaca, purslane. These are functioning to serve sort of the ecosystem of your garden, but they can also be sampled, and you can talk about who eats these on a normal basis. Not all of these are weeds. And the milpa is a wonderful example. If you're really leaning in and loving, really want to talk about sort of the cultural heritage piece of gardens and the ecosystem piece, thinking about the milpa as involving, and it doesn't just have to be Three Sisters. It's any resource or any group of plantings that you can rotate that work together nutritionally and environmentally. So they have both a nutritional and an environmental component. And I talked a little bit about the demographics of our school. So looking at heritage crops, different types of landrace corns and amaranth. Some of this is really, as garden educators, for us to educate ourselves. And there you'll receive some resources about how you might just start going into the conversation of countries of origin. So really knowing who your students are and their cultural heritage, and then thinking about your crop plan from a perspective that includes the countries of origins of some of those crops, right? Not just who eats them now, but how those crops and seeds travel. And that is such a rich place to work with social studies and language arts and geography teachers to mix that into your unit plan. So, and then this also will fall a little bit into integrating natives into your garden. There are also some interesting ways that AGC has rethought our school identity. So previously we were the orcas. What was great about being the orcas is that that's a mascot students chose when the school began. The complicated thing about being the orcas is that we are in Chicago, Illinois, and there is not an ocean in sight anywhere for many, many miles. So sometimes it just felt like a little bit of a missed opportunity. We couldn't really connect our sports teams to regional identity. It didn't really say anything about the history of our place or our students. And so our garden team in partnership with students and some of the designers, petitioned to revision our school mascot, and we've now shifted to the monarchs. So the monarch migration is a really important part. Chicago also happens to be the home of the majority of the Mexican community, who is just a neighborhood over in La Villita and Pilsen. For anyone who's familiar with Chicago, happen to be from Michoacan. So there's a predominance of Mexicans who have moved from Michoacan, and the monarch migration is really reflective of that. And I want to talk a little bit about images or opportunities to think about teaching and learning spaces in your gardens and how you construct those so that those are also identity affirming and culturally relevant. So we started thinking a little bit about students who might feel most comfortable in like collective and collaborative ways of learning, and looking at our outdoor spaces to see if we'd intentionally constructed those. And they don't have to be elaborate, right? But recognizing that there are different moments and teaching and learning opportunities that we could build our space to accommodate. So for example, a space for in the round outdoor classroom learning, where there's a central character. Usually this is an instance where a student might be presenting out. Maybe it's a show and tell, maybe it's a taste and tell. Spaces where it's really focused on sort of individual reflection. It's a quiet space. Students can get small. They can sit comfortably in a shady area. We also thought about places that were like workspaces where kids could get dirty, work in small groups that are interactive, that were sitting at different levels. And then more traditional spaces where there's perhaps like a central speaker, a teacher sharing back out, or a lecture or instruction moment where it's like an all eyes on the instructor. So the way that we're doing this now, we have logs, we have a couple of trees. We're working with our diverse learners teams to think about, are blankets better for some students? Where are the areas that are buffered from noise? And so not only thinking about the kind of crops that we grow, not only thinking about the constructions of the actual growing spaces, but where students gather to meet, teach each other, and to learn. Another part of redesigning the actual structure of your garden can include collaborations with community members. And in your resource folder, there is a wonderful resource called Roots and Routes, which was developed by the Field Museum. And they worked this summer on an intervention in a place called the Burnham Wildlife Corridor, which we will also be moving through with community members. So a lot of families and students and teachers, where it's essentially a design cycle that results in a space that's constructed specifically for people to just come together. And we'll work with our art teachers, and it will actually be like a permanent fixture in our school garden that is a reflection of a collaboration with our students, teachers, and community. So there's a step-by-step guide on that, and some really interesting questions, critical conversations to get that design process up and running. Okay, so we're going to move just a few minutes. I know we're running a little bit tight on time, but maybe what would be best? Yes.
Oh yeah, no, you might be getting to it. I was just thinking, I don't know if we have enough time just to get in, get talking, and come back. And I imagine folks would love to ask you questions. So I wonder if we could just share these as reflection questions and folks would just think about these for a minute or so.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. I think that sounds great. And a lot of these are really for your individual reflection anyway. And hopefully you have, collaborators who are part of your garden educator group, or teachers or administrators, and you can think a little bit about use these questions to talk about the actual construction of your garden. And it can be a change that happens in one garden bed, a section of your garden. You can rearrange a classroom in a learning space, or just think in a more connected way about how some of your practices are already functioning as identity affirming. And we can also, Tristana, do you mind dropping the Padlet? So we also went, since we're not going to have a moment for breakouts, there's a Padlet where you can sort of reflect on these questions. We're going to aggregate everyone's answers, and you can pull resources from one another. There will also be a resource page that has some really specific names of plants, examples of different learning spaces, examples of different historical resources where there's a documentation of other ways of growing, other examples beyond Three Sisters, of like an ecosystem in a school garden type setting. And great, thank you for sharing the resource handout. And would love to see people's responses in the Padlet. And you can kind of see here, there's a little bit of everything here. That great countries of origin, the veggie map is there. Buffalo Bird Women's Garden is a wonderful kind of anthropological guide to different ways of growing and knowing and relating to the land that I found really helpful in redesigning some of our garden beds. That Roots and Routes community gathering space is also really a super important and like easy to adapt to your community guide for how to think about like constructions and interventions in your garden space. And you can drop your questions in the chat. And I think Tristana has been keeping track of questions. Yes. So maybe we can go into a few of those the last few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. First question is, do you have a way in which you define a lot of the terms that we're kind of using here, kind of racism, anti-racism, and then is your school district utilizing, or is your school utilizing these terms as well, or they're kind of like defined by your school?
That is a great question. So we are in conversation, we want to always be participating and part of the Chicago Public School Network. And Chicago Public Schools has developed a lot of resources to support talking with students about defining some of these bigger, more complicated terms like anti-racism, cultural identity, cultural affirmation. And so we definitely lean on our district definitions because we also want our students to share that language. So I think because it really matters to us as part of our mission to not separate from the district, I would say go there first, or that's what we do. In the resource page, there are some of the definitions that I found really helpful in my personal practice as an educator. But it also, I think, different resources serve you based on your lived experience. People are coming into these conversations at different levels. So sometimes, it's not a one size fits all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing what your process and your school's process has been. Let's see. Do you have any advice on getting district facilities and operation more on board with establishing and expanding school gardens?
Yeah, that is a great question. What we tend to do is we tend to build what we need, and unless there have been a very few instances where we've needed to tap into like electrical outlets or things that had to do specifically with like structural resources. We really try to avoid that because it just slows everything down. So what I would offer getting people involved is, it's not a super original answer, but, my role is to build relationships with operations, and just having even a single point person to like acknowledge that they are very, very busy, but we are so grateful and excited to work with them. We'd love to host them and feed them lunch on site. Think about what the resources are you have to share, and like really identify a one point person who can be a consistent voice and contact, share your information, and just keep calling and following up with those people and being super nice and inviting, and try to get them to your campus, because that's the thing, right? Depending on how big your district is, if they never really associate place and people to a job, they're much less likely to be responsive. So relationship building and just showing up over and over and over again.
Amazing, thank you. How does your charter school impact the cityscape, and do students bring these lessons to their neighborhoods?
Okay, interesting question. So because we are serving almost entirely a student body within 5 miles of the school, ask us this question in 2 years after we have a new campus that's like fancy, right? I think people are going to show a different level of interest, and we're grappling with that because our first priority is to serve the folks and families who are on the southwest side of Chicago, right? That's a really, really important part of our mission. And it's a really important part of why the school is in this community. So students are really sharing their knowledge and sort of AGC practice in the blocks surrounding our neighborhood. And the way that also plays out that's specific to the garden is we partner with organizations and nonprofits that offer community services like planting trees in people's front yards. Open Lands is one. And so we initiate the partnership, even though the outcomes are tangible, not on our school grounds, but for community members. So we actively pursue and build relationships that directly impact the community, even when they don't necessarily happen on campus, because all of it's interrelated, right? It's like if we increase the tree canopy in our community, we are also addressing the air quality and pollution for our students. So we just think about all of those things as supporting each other.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. It's a little bit more related to how you manage your garden in general. Have you ever had those in the community who are not necessarily part of the school assist with garden care maintenance during periods when school is not in session?
Yes. That's always the question, right? So many of us are in growing regions where like all the growing happens. And in Chicago, we're definitely in that situation. So much of the growing happens over the summer. And so we do use that as an opportunity. We host a summer school and summer program where students are working in the garden, but it's way fewer students than we have on campus during the school year. So how we extend that is we have a really humble student farm stand, and we do use that to recruit community members. And we do have community member garden days. So they have an opportunity to visit us at the farm stand, meet with our students, talk with our students. But we also do make space for them to have a hand in the garden. And sometimes like liability, you have to think about who you're inviting onto a school campus, right? It can't just be anyone. And sometimes the paperwork is a big deal. And when that is the case, we will sometimes host like adults only or adult facing. We don't call it that, but like I will be there to lead a garden workshop day, and it is a non-school day. It's not programmatic. Students are not on campus.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We've reached the end of our time. You've gotten lots of wonderful acknowledgements of your wisdom and your resource sharing today. So just wanted to also extend our thank you from the SGSO network for being here to share with our network today. If you want to just go to the next slide where it shows different ways that you can stay in touch with the SGSO network. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and our website, sgsonetwork.org. And here is my email, tristana@sgsonetwork.org. You will be receiving an email after this is over, probably in the next day or so, with a copy to all the links that we've shared here today, as well as one to the recording. And then if you go to the next slide, if you could share what you thought with us via our survey, and I will be putting that into the chat once more. Again, it's really helpful to know what you thought, and then also for us to continue to design these webinars based on topics that you would like to hear about. So again, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for sharing, Chris. We will
And
close
happy
this out.
spring, happy
Happy
growing.
spring. Yes, absolutely. Take care, everybody.